This is Tommy's Outdoors 69. And what a great pleasure to have on the podcast Professor Adam Hart once again and talk about wildlife conservation once again. But this time, the angle is the impact of COVID-19 on wildlife conservation. As we know, tourism was impacted, and hunting and fishing is, in many cases, a branch of tourism that funds wildlife conservation. So obviously, worldwide travel bans has an impact on wildlife conservation and on the flow of funds to conservation organizations and whatnot. So we decided to get together and discuss that subject. And also, as you probably know from the previous episode of the podcast, I am quite interested in connection between coronavirus outbreak and biodiversity loss. That's something that kind of is still in the back of my head, and I'm trying to explore that issue. So I took that opportunity and briefly spoke with Adam about this as well on a podcast. So that's a little bit shorter episode this time, but nevertheless very informative, and I sincerely hope you will enjoy it. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Adam Hart. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Tommy.
I think you're our quickest, one of the guests who are quickest to return. I had a guest who were on a podcast twice, but it was usually like a year or 8 months, and you're back just in just a matter of weeks. But I guess there is a lot of stuff that are pretty current and relevant to the current situation. Obviously, for people who are going to be listening to this podcast in a couple of months' time, we are right now in a, let's say, middle of the COVID emergency. So there's a few things related to really touching on what we discussed previously with relation to wildlife and conservation, and what is the impact of that situation, of COVID situation on the wildlife and conservation. But before we go there, you have a book coming.
I do.
It's called Unfit for Purpose. And it is immensely interesting to me because this is a subject that I discussed a lot with a lot of my friends, and is very interesting to me for various reasons. Would you mind to give our listeners quick information about what the book is about? And obviously it's available for pre-order, so everybody should go and pre-order it now.
Yeah, sure. It's basically, it's called Unfit for Purpose, and the idea is that almost in the last generation, in some cases actually in the last 10 years, we've kind of ruthlessly made this modern world for ourselves, but we don't function well in it, and it's almost because our evolutionary heritage, if you like, our biological history is in conflict with the situation that we have now, and we can follow it through some very basic things. So, for example, the classic example is, well, we spend all our life slouching and sitting down to end up with back problems. Yeah, okay, but I was actually exploring some much more, I think, interesting and unusual examples. So looking, for example, at things like our belief in fake news and why we're so keen to sort of believe false information. Actually, you can trace a lot of that back to some of the evolutionary sort of history that we have in terms of developing societies. I look at things like obesity, which is a really interesting story, actually. The kind of classic story is that we get fat because we're famine adapted, and we now live in a time of plenty, so we just keep piling on the pounds. Actually, that isn't really supported by much evidence away from the South Pacific, and there's a whole load of really interesting stories that develop around that to look at predation and things like that. I look at stress, which of course is a big problem in the modern world, but a massive lifesaver.
That's a big one, and especially everybody who are involved in any sort of leadership training and anything like that. So essentially, people who need to take care of their subordinates in the workplace. This is kind of common theme that stress and all the hormonal response of our body is really, well, not fit for purpose. Yeah. That's what's going on right now.
It's a really good response, back in the day when we had big stresses that were immediately life-threatening. But of course, as we started to develop, I mean, you can almost probably trace this back to the beginning of sort of things like agriculture, which had a huge effect on our lives, and a huge effect on our physical sort of being as well. The evolution of agriculture was really significant, and from that point, we started to have city-states. We changed the way that we lived from a way that we'd adapted for to this new way. Now, we did adapt to some of those things. The fact that we can drink milk, for example, is a great evolutionary adaptation, not found throughout the world, actually, almost in a minority, in fact. And that's another interesting kind of chapter, this idea of dietary intolerances. So we can evolve to adapt to our new environment, but of course, these are quite slow responses. And what we've seen over the last sort of century or so is a huge change in the way that we live. And, we have day-to-day stresses that people didn't have even 5 or 10 years ago, social media stresses, work-life balance, the stress of simply having everyone else judging what we're doing all the time. And all of these things link together really neatly, and that actually leads on in the book to a chapter talking about social networks. So the idea of online lives, our online life, I mean, that's kind of what we're doing now, right? This is a podcast. I mean, we're speaking to each other, but it will then exist online. We'll be talking about it on Twitter. These sorts of things 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago would have been pie in the sky. So we've changed the way that we live so dramatically, and it's interesting to see how that kind of conflicts with our evolutionary background. And then I talk about things like gut bacteria, addiction, which is kind of important, particularly in the modern world, and also discuss violence in its evolutionary context. As a species, are we unusually violent? It turns out actually we are, but equally we're not the only species that kills each other. That's very widely.
Do you think we're violent as a species?
We are, if you look at it phylogenetically, so if you look at us in relation to other animals that we are related to, and you look across the kind of piece, then we are violent, but equally we come from a very violent lineage. The primates are actually quite violent to each other, and part of that is because they're social. In a lot of cases, they live in groups. They're also highly territorial, which is another big factor. And of course, for us, we're kind of quite well put together if we want to be violent, really. Where we've got hands that make fists. There's a really interesting section in the book where I talk about somebody's got the hypothesis that actually, the fist is basically sort of the way our hands are done is made for hitting. Not a lot of support for it, but it brings up some interesting stories. We've got arms and legs and feet and elbows and knees where we're relatively strong. A lot of people are very keen on sort of putting us down as an animal, but actually when you think about it, we're pretty well put together. We're good all rounders. We're fast. We're strong. We've got hands. So we are kind of moving in that direction. And if you look at our history, violence has come and gone, and violence is actually one of the harder chapters to write for this because there are so many competing hypotheses. You can find good support for the idea that we are more violent than we used to be, that we're less violent than we used to be, that we're exactly the level of violence that you would expect, that modern society has helped us to become less violent, or that modern society has made us more violent.
Okay.
So it's really, really interesting to try and unpick some of these things, and of course to look at the influence of media on violence too, which I find really interesting because people still present that as being quite controversial. And actually, when you look through the literature, it's really not controversial at all. That sort of monkey see, monkey do. What's controversial, I suppose, is the extent to which it influences us and how we can sort of explain certain patterns that we see. But yeah, so it started off really as a kind of quite a biological book, but obviously as these things evolve, we start talking about all kinds of things from psychological theories to the development of agriculture, politics, all kinds of bits and pieces, as is usually the case when we're chatting as well, of course, because very few things operate in a nice clean vacuum. So it always drags everything else in.
I really can't wait to read that book, and perhaps we do yet another podcast once the book is out and kind of discuss that, because that's super interesting. Tell us where the book is coming out.
It's coming out in early June, I think June the 11th. It's on Amazon actually. If you search for Unfit for Purpose, you'll find it. You can pre-order it there. You can also pre-order it from the publishers, which is Bloomsbury. So yeah, you can do all the pre-order and then it'll be out. Well, if we're allowed to go to bookshops by June, who knows how the world will be in a few months? It's hard to believe how much it's changed in the last couple of weeks. But assuming that things are relatively back to normal, you may even be able to go into a bookshop and buy it by June as well. Fingers crossed.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Cool. Okay, so let's get to the kind of like a main subject, really, of this podcast, and we're going back to a little bit to the subject of the previous one, where we talked in length about wildlife conservation, and now what is the impact of the COVID emergency pandemic on wildlife? And most obvious one would be, I think, how tourism is impacted, or in general movement of people is impacted. And would that be the biggest hit on wildlife and conservation?
Possibly. So if we cast our minds back to when the foot and mouth outbreak happened, and we ended up people not being able to visit the countryside, actually what we saw here in the UK was some considerable benefits actually for a number of species because people weren't disturbing them. And we've already seen lots of press reports and media reports now about wildlife coming into our towns. People are reporting hearing more birds, and actually it's purely anecdotal, but I went for a walk nearby where I live, and I saw muntjac deer and roe deer prints in areas far, far closer to the road than I've ever seen them before. And I know that area is well used by dog walkers, and yet I could see from the prints on the ground that there have been far fewer dog walkers around. So, we do get these benefits which are being widely reported, but far more subtle, and I'm sure will be reported more and more as this goes on, are the negative effects. And the negative effects really, there'll be no surprise to us to realize that economic, predominantly at the moment. And you're right, tourism is a big problem. So if you're running, as is the case, I'm mostly going to be talking about Southern Africa, but this sort of goes across the piece. If you're running a system whereby you get your funding to fund conservation action, so to fund habitat protection, to fund people that work for you, to fund the sort of land improvements that you need to do, and fencing and anti-poaching and all this kind of stuff. If you're funding that from, let's call it tourism in the round for now, then that tap was basically turned off extremely abruptly. It's difficult at the moment because everything's happening. There's so many things happening so quickly. It's very hard sometimes to get a handle on just how rapidly all this has happened. But for example, South Africa brought in a travel ban just a couple of weeks ago. They're in the middle of a 3-week lockdown now. I think they're about 10 days through at the moment. The travel ban was put in place about 5 days before that. That's only 2 weeks before. And suddenly no tourist will go to South Africa. I mean, you're not allowed. If you're from the UK, you can't fly there. It's as simple as that. They're not letting us in. So their financial model is based on overseas people coming in, and predominantly in those areas they're talking about people doing ecotourism, and also, of course, as we discussed in the previous program, in many countries, South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Zambia, they're also having people coming in for hunting, and those have also stopped. Actually, it appears from early reports that potentially hunters were a bit slower to withdraw than tourists. So some ecotourists had withdrawn before these travel bans. I mean, the writing was on the wall for a few weeks, but now there is no overseas money coming in, and that's going to have, and it is already having, an effect. The primary effect it's probably going to have initially, and certainly what people are telling me in areas of South Africa is an increase in poaching, and an increase in poaching of two kinds, really. The first kind is bushmeat poaching.
Yeah.
So this is people going in, illegally entering, if you like, areas, or illegally taking from those areas species for meat. Now, that's increasing for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, if people are in lockdown around and they can't get to shops, and they're perhaps economically disadvantaged by that, which is going to be the case, then they will turn to alternative means, just as you or I would. There's no difference. If I had nothing in my freezer now and my kids were hungry, I'd have to go out
Oh,
and find something to eat, right? So
absolutely. We were saying that I'm lucky enough to can go fishing nearby because it's very close to my house. So that was exactly my thought. If I catch the fish, that fish is coming back with me. I'm catch and release angler, but this time, no, I'm gonna take it with me, and that goes to the freezer. So
absolutely right, and that's what we're finding, and so that's the bushmeat side of things, and I think sometimes we have a slightly romantic kind of illusion of poaching, as I think possibly because of sort of literature of the UK and or English language literature, but actually most of this poaching is quite brutal. They will go in with dogs, and snaring is very, very common. So capable of removing really without any selectivity fairly large numbers of individuals in quite an aggressive and brutal way.
I have a question, because does it not gonna balance itself out? Because on one end you have obviously the increase of on poaching for these reasons that we're discussing right now, but then also a lot of poaching is going on by cartels from Asia, from Vietnam, and so on and so forth. Particularly, I think the rhino horn. So is that not stopped because of a travel ban, or as usual, those criminals they have their own ways of getting in and out of the country, and that's not stopping them?
Well, exactly. This is the second form of poaching. So the first form of poaching, really bushmeat poaching, both for local subsistence, but also to provide meat for a wider area, so wider communities. So people will run, illegal butcheries based on what they've caught, and in other cases, they will be exporting that meat overseas, which of course is another problem. That will have been. The exportation overseas will probably be reduced for sure. However, the local supply isn't. And I mean, I spoke to a reserve last week, and they'd had poachers come in. Their bushmeat poaching has spiked hugely. I mean, it's virtually zero for some months, and now they're having incursions daily. And the last incursion involved the digging up of a warthog burrow. With dogs, so they took all the warthogs out. So that would have been a sounder of probably this time of year, probably 4 or 5 piglets and a female, possibly a male in the vicinity, although not very commonly. But that burrow complex is also used by an aardvark, which they haven't seen sign of, so they probably would have taken that. There was a very large, a rather majestic python, one of the largest I've ever seen, that also lived in that burrow complex, which again, if they'd have found, would have been taken. So that sort of indiscriminate hunting, entirely understandable at a time of crisis, and all of that is very good meat. I can't say whether aardvark's good meat. I'm afraid I've never seen one, let alone eaten one, but certainly that is protein, but it's indiscriminate. So when you get people coming in night after night, putting on snare lines, just taking out whatever they can, you start to see a real problem. But the second form of poaching, of course, is if you like, valuable product poaching. So predominantly we're talking about rhino horn and elephant ivory, and I know in that area, so Northwest Province, they've already seen spikes in rhino horn poaching in a number of places above and beyond what they were experiencing, and that is because they're unable to run the number of patrols that they were running. And you're absolutely right, criminals don't, all of this stuff is illegal anyway. So they were flying, a lot of horn was being flown out through Johannesburg Airport. They would occasionally find some. Obviously, those international flights are not happening, or happening in much fewer numbers. That's potentially going to make it difficult. But we've seen across Africa people bringing out things in diplomatic bags or under diplomatic cover. And of course, there's also shipping, and then cartels can store rhino horn. So if it's easy to get right now, but it's difficult to ship, well, you focus your activities on what part of your business is thriving, right? And if it turns out that the pipeline is easily supplied, but you can't quite open the tap at the moment, well, you build up your supplies. So that is the concern. Now, at the moment, it's too early for sure, of course, to say whether those concerns are translating. And I know lots of areas are at great pains to point out that they are still patrolling heavily. I saw a message from Botswana yesterday and Namibia. They're anti-poaching, our frontline essential services. They're stepping it up. They know that there's going to be more pressure on them. The problem with rhino, of course, is quite special, really, because quite a large proportion, potentially a third or even higher, of all rhino in the world now are held by private owners in South Africa on
Yes.
privately owned land, and they don't receive any money really from the government to keep the rhinos safe. Many of them are spending 60% of their income on rhino security most of the time anyway.
Yeah.
Now, the areas that I've been in touch with, they have lost all income now, absolutely zero income apart from meat. So they're able still to hunt some animals on their ground and sell them. So that's one source of income. But most of their income is coming from tourists, educational tourists in one case, and ecotourists in another, and from hunting, overseas and domestic. And that's all basically been cut off. So they are now reliant pretty much on donor funds. So, fundraising from friends and from family and what they can do, adopting rhino schemes and stuff, just to fuel up their vehicles. So that is the concern, that private rhino owners have had great success actually in limiting poaching. There's far more rhino poached from national parks like the Kruger than from private areas, but now the national parks may be able to keep their levels of anti-poaching more or less the same, whereas private areas might not. So all of these things are kind of in the mix, but at the moment it's too early to say for sure what's really happening. But certainly those are the concerns. And we talked about earlier about sort of tourism being cut off, but of course, if you're relying on donor funds as well, that's also a problem right now.
Right. Oh, yeah. I heard that the NGOs and everything, every organization who is based on donations, they're struggling as well, and I guess that's related to the uncertainty. So the people are less likely to donate money because obviously the unemployment rates are on the rise, and a lot of people lost their job, and a lot of people afraid that they're gonna lose their job, or so this is like in general, the economy is going down, and that impacts the conservation. It's very interesting how this relates.
Yes, yeah, it is, and I mean, you're absolutely right. I guess in a time of uncertainty, people tend to look inwards rather than outwards, and that's inevitable. And I don't think anyone can be judged for that. However, it'll be interesting to see how it affects across the board, because some of the very large NGOs, and we don't need to name names, but some of the very large and famous NGOs that appear to be involved in conservation, actually, when you dig down, relatively little. I mean, some cases, single figure percentage, often less than 5, goes to on the ground conservation work. And actually, some of the work that is defined as conservation, particularly the larger animal rights organizations, really isn't. It's orphanages, or it's relocating animals from one place to another. It doesn't really, what we need is people that buy land and protect animals. So it may well be that their reduction of funding has a great influence on their organization, but actually doesn't knock on that much into on the ground conservation. But then you've got an awful lot of NGOs as well. Things like Rhino Conservation Botswana, for example. They look after and guard a considerably large proportion of Botswana's rhino, in fact, probably most of them really in the Okavango Delta, and they need a lot of funding to do that, and every penny goes to the ground. But obviously, if they're affected by those sorts of donation crises, then suddenly we may see more of an effect. So I think there's going to be a lot of mopping up at the end of this, and a lot of research and interest shown, because what has been exposed really, really swiftly actually is how vulnerable these types of conservation models are to external forces.
That's what you said last time. That's exactly what you said. What you said last time, which was, by the way, for the first time, really strong argument, like you said, to move away conservation, basing conservation on hunting and tourism, the way it should be moved away. And that was your argument, that because it's so fragile, which I thought was like, wow, I never thought about that. And fast forward a couple of weeks, and we're seeing exactly that.
Yeah. Yes. Unfortunately, I turned out to be right. But yeah, it's I mean, that's what it exposes. And what we'll also see, which I think is going to be really interesting, is, I mean, interesting from an external perspective, heartbreaking, of course, as well, if you look at it up close. But it'll be interesting to see how the different models recover afterwards. So, for example, areas that rely largely on tourism and national parks and so on, that rely largely on pure tourism. Well, are we going to see tourist areas able to recover quite quickly? compared to hunting areas. And I think my prediction is that areas that rely on hunting will probably recover faster, because I think hunters will be more keen to go out.
Yes.
I think they'll be more keen to show their support. They'll have missed going out hunting. They would have missed it. They won't have been able to go out for a few months, even in the local area. They'll want to go out. They'll want to get the ground under their boots again, and they'll understand the financial problems that these places are under, because generally hunters have a very close relationship with the people that they hunt with on the ground.
Yeah.
These are places they go back to. They're people that they're in contact with.
Yeah.
So I suspect that hunting will recover a little bit faster than tourism. I suspect that in some cases, some tourist outfits will be unable to recover. I know of one place near the Kruger National Park that's basically not going to be open again.
Oh.
They can't survive this. They're on the edge. It all depends on the business model, and you can't sort of generalize. But I suspect that we will see a reduction in those places. Whether that will have ramifications for conservation is hard to say. But the other issue is how fast people will want to go on holiday again.
Yes.
And obviously, that a lot of that will depend on how stable and secure the destinations appear. Now, at the moment, we're not seeing a lot of general news coming out of Southern Africa, for example, but I'm seeing reports. I'm getting people WhatsApping me stuff that suggests that the police might be being a bit heavy-handed in places, that there are definite pockets of unrest. I mean, the lockdown that they've imposed is across the country. Well, it's a very different kettle of fish if you're locked down in a nice, expensive house on the beautiful areas in Johannesburg, or out in the country somewhere in your state, right? That's a very different thing to being locked down in one of the townships or whatever. On top of that, the government in South Africa have also banned the sale of alcohol and tobacco, cigarettes, across that 3-week period, which is a hell of a thing to do. I mean, if they did that here, I don't know how well that would go down. Well, I do. It would go down extremely poorly. I mean, I think people would ignore it. It would cause problems, and I know that it's causing problems down there now. Whether those problems spill over, there's always issues anywhere, right? So we don't want to picking any particular place, but if we start seeing lots of reports about, once the media cycle starts getting bored with the current thing, they'll look elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
And they'll look around and see, well, how is it affecting different parts of the world? If we start seeing reports from countries which are traditional tourist destinations that suggest there's, pockets of civil unrest.
Yes.
Or if there are indeed pockets of civil unrest, if in some places it causes political instability, which is not entirely impossible, because everyone is very critical about how every government around the world has handled this. If we start seeing that, and then we start seeing foreign Commonwealth advisories, we start seeing people go, well, try and avoid this area because there's riots. Suddenly we might find that tourists who just want to go on safari maybe might go somewhere else that year, or they might look to do a different type of holiday. So there's also going to be that kind of playing in, and it's really too early to say, but clearly the recovery phase, how we come out of this, is going to be affecting different places in different ways. And I guess that's also going to apply to people donating to charities and NGOs again. When will they feel secure enough to start those direct debits going to suddenly go, I'm going to go and give £100 to this charity, or I'm going to buy these products I don't really need, but they're kind of nice to have because 25% goes to rhino conservation or whatever. I guess that kind of recovery is hard to predict at the moment.
Yeah, and I guess you're right, and this is also something that we touched on the last episode, is that hunters and anglers, they're kind of have a little bit different mentality. It's more they let's say they're more dedicated, and they're more willing to go and kind of do what they do. And the other thing is that this is kind of like a much smaller scale operation, I guess, because you're taking like 10 anglers, or you're taking 2 hunters. It's quite different than you have like a whole bunch of people who are going week after week, and even in a situation where there's unrest. I know that the people are traveling to go fishing or go hunting into destinations who are like usually advised rather not go there. But this is all about, the outfitter knows people who he's supposed to know at the airport, and this guy comes in and they just go in and everything is sorted. While this sort of arrangement probably would never work if you bring in group of 20 or 15 people and they're like tourists expecting luxury and being taken care of. So that's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. It is a very different business model, and you're right. I mean, in terms of the sort of how much of an effect local conditions have, it tends to affect hunters less than, and anglers less than conventional tourists. You've also got the problem that if you've got, let's say you've got a client coming in who's going to spend $40,000, $50,000 to go hunting for 3 weeks. That's one person on the ground with a fairly small crew of sort of people to support them.
Yeah.
To get a resort up and running that's used to having, say, I don't know, minimum 200-300 people on board. Well, those 200-300 people need almost the same facilities as one person, right? So they're going to need chefs, they're going to need bartenders, they're going to need a receptionist, cleaners. So suddenly sort of tooling one of those places up from stop up to full capacity, that trajectory is going to be problematic in terms of doing it and making it stable. And of course, many of those places will have had to have either furlough or get rid of staff, which causes economic problems locally, which we know that only tends to exacerbate pressures on natural areas, because people can't afford to go and buy wood, so they're going to go and chop it down where they can. People can't afford to buy meat, they're going to go and buy it where they can. So we know all of these things are going to have knock-on effects. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, at the moment, all we can do is keep our fingers crossed that we come out of it, for all sorts of reasons, of course, but from a conservation perspective, that we come out of this in a way that allows all of these different operators to come through. We said earlier, what this really highlights is the fragility. I guess what it also highlights is the importance of having more than one iron in the fire.
Oh yeah.
Just relying on a particular group in any particular area, suddenly you're gone. Whereas if you've got a bit of hunting, maybe, some reserves, I know they don't do a lot of hunting, but I can be pretty sure that as soon as people are able to move, they're going to be asking a few of their hunting clients, do you fancy coming over, because they're going to need the revenue.
Absolutely. So I guess the conclusion is that the fact that we see wildlife kind of coming out of the woods and walking around areas where they traditionally were not walking around, this is just temporary. This doesn't really have anything to do with conservation. There's less people, less disturbance. Wildlife is coming in, but that's not really any long-term benefit for conservation. But what we're discussing now is impacting conservation in a negative way. So I guess the overall the balance is negative for
yes,
wildlife.
I think that's probably the case. It's difficult to kind of come up with an overall balance, but yeah, I mean, when you look at the potential harms, those potential harms are quite great. However, it is kind of interesting. A lot of species will do better from this. Birds may nest better, they may produce more offspring. Mammals may well do better with less. But what I also think is kind of interesting, and I don't know whether this is partly down to sort of an echo chamber that social media and what you view online tends to perpetuate, right? But I'm seeing a lot of kind of narratives developing now about how people are feeling like they're missing nature. They're feeling like when all this is over, they're going to be much more engaged with nature. There's this kind of overall arching kind of idea that actually, nature was more important than we thought. Now, I guess a potential benefit of all of this is that when we come out, if that's translated into action, of course, I mean, everyone's talking about big at the moment. Oh, we're going to see new ways of doing things. We've got a very, very short memory.
Mm-hmm.
Once life's back to normal, I wonder whether those lessons will be learned.
Yeah.
But maybe we will see this kind of development of people taking nature a bit more seriously or being more involved with it. I don't know.
I agree with you. I agree with you here that I personally, I don't think that we're gonna come back better and we learned anything, and we probably just gonna resume the business as usual, 8 months maximum from when it's over. That's at least my view. Listen, I know you don't have a lot of time today, so I want to quickly touch on one other subject, which is, again, I had a number of conversations about this recently, and I'm really curious about your view on it. So there is this narrative developing, and you could see quite a few articles published on various newspapers that the current outbreak of coronavirus is related to biodiversity loss. And in general, it goes like that, okay, we're pushing further and further into the areas that were traditionally, people were not there, and we're coming into the contact with wildlife even more. And so there is more opportunities for those zoonotic diseases coming to people, and this is what's happening. This is why we have this outbreak, because we pushing so hard into the environment and those undiscovered areas. And to be honest, there is something in it, but I have a problem with that. I'm not sure if I agree with that fully, because it almost sounds like the less nature we have and the less animals we have, because we're destroying the habitat and so on, we're coming more in contact with them. So I am not sure. People are sure. Like, number one, there's really very few really pristine, untouched areas right now. So there's nothing new. And obviously people were coming in contact with all those animals before. And if there is more of these animals, and let's say we're not doing to nature what we're doing right now, there will be more of these animals. So there will be more opportunities to get in touch with those animals and transmit those diseases. So it's kind of like a counterintuitive to me. And on top of that, again, this is an article that I read some time ago. Is perhaps the problem is not that we are have too much contact with nature. The problem is that we don't have enough contact with wildlife, with nature. We too much detached from the environment, and our immune system is not what it's supposed to be. We can't deal with those diseases how we supposed to be dealing. Plus the volume and the mass transport, and the people who can be, one day in China and another day in New York and the third day in London. This is really a problem. And maybe it's not that related to biodiversity loss and the fact that we're pushing in those areas that we've never pushed before, allegedly. So I am not sure if I agree with that argument, although I appreciate that it can be true. So I'm curious, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, I guess first of all, in the past, so if we look in the deep past, we wouldn't necessarily know if a zoonotic disease broke out somewhere in the middle of nowhere and never took hold anywhere else. Maybe in past literature of some far-flung place in some far-flung era, there was a mysterious disease that wiped out all the old people or something, and it was just put down to we don't know. But because people didn't travel as far, and they didn't travel as frequently, it just didn't have any chance to go, or because that disease was particularly unpleasant. So, I mean, if we think about Ebola, for example, Ebola is a terrible disease, awful, but it has one thing going for it, at least for the wider world, is that it's so bad, it kills people before it gets much of a chance to get a hold, and it produces symptoms which are extremely obvious. So consequently, people can be isolated. So it causes huge problems locally, but it doesn't go anywhere. Whereas what we've got with COVID-19 is almost the exact opposite. It takes a while to come on. For a lot of people, it doesn't seem to have much of an effect. Some people are even asymptomatic whilst they pass it on, and other people get absolutely hammered by it, and that's what we're seeing. So it could well be that in the past, something like this would have broken out somewhere, and because people didn't travel around, it caused a local problem and got lost in the midst of time. But of course, we have a lot of zoonotic diseases, animal flu, anthrax, tuberculosis, bovine TB anyway, brucellosis, dengue fever, Ebola, encephalitis, giardiitis, hepatitis. I've just got a list of them up here: listeria infection, Lyme disease, malaria. These are all zoonoses, right?
Yeah.
Psittacosis, rabies, ringworm, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, swine flu, toxoplasmosis, West Nile virus, right? But, this is not an uncommon thing, and at some point they have been able to spread. So, are we seeing just the influence? Are we seeing just a natural progression? Yeah, this is the latest zoonosis, the long line of them. I think probably that's possibly the case. I think that's exacerbated by the way that we live, I suppose, linked to kind of what we were talking about earlier about sort of unfit for purpose. The way that our modern life lives provides an ideal opportunity for these things to spread. But in terms of our connection with the natural world, well, we don't have any immune response to COVID-19. It's a novel infection. We develop it by getting it. So that wouldn't have any effect. So there's sort of, if you like, the hygiene hypothesis, the idea that we're not challenging our immune system, actually doesn't stand up to a lot of scrutiny when you dig down into the different parts of it, although it is relevant to some areas. That's probably not the case either, because it's these are novel things. We don't generally eat unusual animals these days. Most people's diet is fairly constrained, probably, compared to what it was. So you could argue that we have less of a chance. Most people don't handle wildlife. You see something dead, you don't pick it up and wonder if there's something useful to be had off it. Whereas that would have been the case, not that long ago. So we could argue that actually much less likely to do this. But of course, yeah, we are advancing into the into the world, into the natural world more. I mean, it's interesting that China, comes up for this, because I was talking to someone a couple of years ago, in fact, probably 3 or 4 years ago now, because they were finding more and more people in China were getting killed by giant hornets. So the sort of oriental giant hornet, the Vespa mandrinia, huge thing, biggest social wasp in the world, massive, fascinating, lives in large colonies of like 50 or 60. The problem is they're very large venomous glands, very, very large stings, and if you get nailed by 10 of them, then you pretty much a goner, and some people are allergic to even one. They're very, very painful and very serious, and they were finding that there were more and more deaths, went up from a couple to sort of 20 or 30 a month. And what was the reason? And the reason that was coming out was because of the massive engineering and building projects that were going on in China, the sort of expansion of cities that most people have never heard of. I mean, there are cities in China that are the size of London that most people have never heard of. We our knowledge of Chinese geography generally across the world, I'm generalizing, but in general, people, we're not particularly au fait with these sorts of things. And actually, there were very big expansions. And the argument was that these cities were rapidly expanding into areas that were previously pretty much uninhabited, and people were coming into contact more with these insects. And that's what was causing the spike in deaths. I suppose that could be an argument for this, except that we don't know. I mean, currently, so I looked this up just before I came on with you, that currently we don't know exactly where it came from. We know that it probably originated in bats. We think pangolins may have been involved somewhere, but actually that's starting to look more shaky now. At the moment, we don't really know exactly where it came from. So it's tricky to speculate, but I would say, looking at the long list of zoonoses that have affected us, in a sense, this is not particularly unusual. It's a new one that's come along, and we're going to deal with it, hopefully. But yeah, one thing's for sure, there is going to be a sort of, if you like, a scientific research literature effect of COVID-19 for many years to come, as people, dig into this more and more, because this is a real, this is a global thing. SARS was kind of a global thing, but I don't think people were they were worried about it, but it never felt, never really impacted.
It never was at our doorsteps.
Right? Yeah. Whereas this now, it is global. This is a pandemic, and it's the first one in the modern era that we've really had a handle on. This isn't like plague in the Middle Ages where, we didn't have the internet, right? This is suddenly something where everyone can be updated with everything. I can look on the computer and get the latest death figures from anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
This is, it really heightens things, of course, as well. But it shows just how interconnected the planet is now, and that's something which has influence on conservation too. This interconnectivity, this idea of using wildlife. Suddenly, people are up in arms that people are eating all these animals. Well, that's the resources they have. If you can do it sustainably, is that a problem? It starts to bring all these kind of issues up. So it's interesting. But I guess, to go back to your original question, I'm not sure. I think we need to wait really until we find out much more about it. But I think the enhanced connectivity of the human world now is undoubtedly a big factor in this. This was able to get a hold globally in a way that no other disease recently has been able to.
Exactly. Okay, Adam, listen, I know you're stuck for time, so I'm going to let you go. Thanks a lot for your time. Thanks for sharing with us this information, and everybody should pre-order your book, and thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tommy.